But as a Southerner, it breaks my heart when I hear people dismiss the people I grew up with, the places I'm from, the beliefs that they have. And frankly, we all know it's not just about dismissing faraway Southerners. There are these divides within our own state.
Welcome to the Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. The birth rate in the U.S. has been crashing since 2007. Are smartphones to blame? Yes, according to a groundbreaking new study co-authored by Caitlin Myers, the John G. McCullough Professor of Economics at Middlebury College. Her study is garnering national attention this week, confirming an idea that people have long speculated about, but until now have not been able to prove. Professor Myers is also well known for her studies of the effects of abortion policy on people's lives. She's testified in the U.S. Senate about the economic consequences of the 2022 Dobbs decision ending the constitutional right to abortion, and she spearheaded the amicus brief in the Dobbs case that was signed by over 150 economists. It highlighted the negative impact of limiting abortion access. Caitlin Myers grew up in rural West Virginia and Georgia. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and the New Yorker. She spoke to me from her office at Middlebury College. Professor Caitlin Myers, welcome to the Vermont Conversation.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So your latest research begins with the pretty shocking fact that U.S. fertility rate has dropped by almost a quarter since 2007, something I did not know, and I think that will surprise a lot of people. That is staggering. What made you look at iPhones as the cause of this?
Yeah, so births are plummeting, and we don't really know why. So the standard explanations that an economist and many demographers would kind of pull out of their back pocket would be things like, oh, it's the economy, right? Births tend to cycle with the economy. So births started to plummet in the time of the Great Recession. And initially we were like, well, it's the economy. But then the economy recovered and births never did. They just kept going down. Then we talk about things like the cost of childcare, the cost of housing prices, increased use of contraception. But the truth is, when you look at the data, it doesn't really match up with those explanations. So births are plummeting, and it's primarily driven by declines in unintended pregnancies among young people. So the stories we tell about people planning their fertility and changing their plans are probably not the right stories for this phenomenon. And so I started to look elsewhere, and I was really swayed by work by psychologists, including John Haidt, on the effects of smartphones on young people, but also on us all. And so if you kind of look at the social psychologists, they're saying, hey, 2007, the moment when fertility started to go down, is also a moment when loneliness started to go up, isolation started to go up, depression and anxiety started to go up. And guess what else happened then? The iPhone was introduced. And so people other than me had been pointing to the iPhone and pointing to smartphones in general as like a possible explanation for a long time. But the problem is correlation isn't causation. So it's really tricky to go from here's a theory to here's a scientific test.
Right. And just to go to that old adage, correlation is not causation, meaning, well, I'll let you explain what that means and why it fell apart as you looked at this.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, anybody who's taken a statistics course, and hopefully just anybody at all, has heard this adage correlation isn't necessarily causation. I'm an applied microeconomist, and my work essentially, in a nutshell, is using statistical methods to figure out when it is. So, the gold
I just
standard,
I just want
yeah,
to interrupt to define that. It means that just because something happened at the same time, like the iPhone came out, doesn't mean it
right.
caused it.
Sure, lots of things were happening at the same time, right? So we could point to other things, like, for instance, the Great Recession's happening at the same time. That causes housing prices to start going up, right? There's other factors. So just because things are happening together doesn't mean that one is causing the other. We should be very cautious about making that leap from I see these two things happening together to one is causing the other. But from a policy perspective, we usually really want to know what's causing the other. Like we usually want to know the causal effects.
So connect an iPhone to a reduction in the birth rate.
Sure. So let me give you the theory and then let me give you the method. So the theory is iPhones come out. They are, I think it's reasonable to characterize them as the first modern smartphone. They introduce, the touch screen. You can swipe. The App Store comes out with the second gen phone a year later. And kind of subsequent phones are all modeled on the iPhone. Like this is what we think of as a phone now. This phone, the theory goes, caused people to start spending less time together in person. It also potentially caused people to have more information about contraception and abortion. So that's also a reason it could be linked to births. And it also caused people, we think, to increase their use of pornography, which also could be related to sexual behavior and births. So, for all of those reasons, the iPhone is a plausible candidate that might have affected how we form relationships and might have affected fertility. But in terms of actually getting in there and figuring out if it really is causal, there's two options. One is somebody gives me like a universe splitter, and I go to 2007 and I split off millions of alternate realities. Some have the iPhone, some don't. And then I follow everybody and I see what happens to births. Like that, if I could do it, would be my gold standard for causation. Unfortunately, I do not have that power, nor does anybody else that I know of. So I'm stuck without my universe splitter looking for what we call a natural experiment. And in our paper, we came up with a natural experiment that just hadn't been used before. I was a little bit surprised to find it lying on the ground. Like the joke in economics is there's no dollar bill lying on the ground. Somebody would have picked it up. But like my co-author Zeke and I found this natural experiment. And this is it. When Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007, they gave AT&T a carrier monopoly. So to get an iPhone, you pretty much had to be able to go to an AT&T cellular store and buy it there and use AT&T broadband coverage. And so folks living in Vermont might remember I was living in Vermont back in 2007. You couldn't get an iPhone in most of Vermont because AT&T didn't have great coverage in a lot of Vermont, certainly not in Addison County where I'm at. So whether you could get an iPhone depended on whether you had access to AT&T. And they had there were some places in the United States where they had great coverage, and it's not always where you expect, by the way. They had great coverage in South Dakota, but not North Dakota. So it just depended on where they had built out their network or acquired a regional carrier. So we've got places with AT&T where you can get an iPhone, places where you can't. And the natural experiment here is, hey, let's compare what happens to births in the places where you can get an iPhone compared to the places where you can't. That's how we get at causation.
So people hear South Dakota, they hear Vermont and New York. These two things are not alike in many
Sure.
respects. Um, so how do you drill down further into
Yeah, it's
apples to apples?
are you sure you're not an applied microeconomist? Because that's actually
I assure you I'm not, but
no, that is the question. You can
I
come
may
to a
play one on the
seminar.
radio.
Okay. Well, you just come on over to a seminar and be like, "Are you sure that's causal?" Because that's our sport. Okay, so that is exactly what my co-author Zeke and I really worry about. So let me start by saying, if you just take a really simple look, counties that get iPhones versus counties that don't, you can see in the simplest of data, you can see in just a bar chart. You don't have to use any fancy statistics. Births plummet in the counties that get iPhones, and they don't fall as much in the counties that don't. Now, this is for young people for whom births are plummeting. Now, if we go to older people who are 35 plus, that's a group where births have actually been rising, just not by nearly enough to offset the declines in births to young people. So that's why overall fertility is going down. But if you look at these older people, what's happening is in places where you could not get an iPhone, their births are going up for these people 35 plus. But if you could get an iPhone, they're not going up very much at all. So any age group you look at, you compare those trends, and it would point to births decline where you can get an iPhone at the time you can get an iPhone. But AT&T's coverage, the places you could get an iPhone, did tend to be more urban than the places that you couldn't. So the big concern here is that maybe there's something special about the urban areas where all of a sudden, like, there's some other spurious factor uh, that suddenly like just kicks in at exactly the same time the iPhone comes out that's particular to these urban areas that makes their bursts fall. Like that would be the thing you would worry about. So we actually throw a lot of stuff at that. So in a couple of ways. First of all, we can just add a bunch of controls. Like we can use fancier statistical models than bar charts, and we can add a bunch of controls to them. So we can control for things like housing prices, the unemployment rate, racial demographic composition. We can control for like reproductive policies. Kind of you come up with it, we can just throw it in the model to be like, was that it? None of that stuff budges this result. Then we can do something that's even fancier, which is use new methodologies that construct what are called synthetic control groups. And the idea basically is we take counties where births looked really, really similar before the iPhone came out. Like they, not just in levels, but in trends, like they are just going right along together. These counties look just really similar to each other until 2007, when some of them get an iPhone and some of them don't. And what we see is it's exactly at that moment that their births diverge, even though they looked so similar before then. And then the final thing we throw at it is what are called placebo checks, where we basically pretend like there are iPhones where there aren't. So we do things like pretend like the iPhone came out a year sooner. We don't see an effect. We pretend like you could get an iPhone in places that have Verizon coverage but not AT&T coverage. We don't see an effect. So, we're throwing everything we can at this, and I would say the result is super robust. We just can't kill it.
So you titled your paper, Is the iPhone Birth Control?
Yeah.
And you answer that question now? How?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the iPhone, well, I think let me give you the super cautious answer, and then let me give you a little bit broader answer of what I think it means and doesn't mean. So here's the super cautious answer. I think the iPhone played a large role in the reduction of births between 2007 and 2011. In fact, our results suggest that as like about a third to a half of the reduction in births was explained by the iPhone. That's the cautious, doesn't sound very cautious, but that's a cautious result.
That's pretty huge.
And it's huge. The reason I'm being cautious is our natural experiment that we're using really stops working in 2011. By 2011, you can pretty much get a smartphone just about anywhere. So this whole comparison that we're doing, it's just not valid anymore. Um, I think it's perfectly likely that all smartphones. I don't think the iPhone's unique. It was just the first modern smartphone. I think all smartphones likely have this effect. I think the effect spread to other places. I think the effect could have grown as more and more people had the phones. But nothing about our research can actually nail that down empirically. So our result takes this really important but narrow slice of time and says, "Ooh, right there when we really look at it, it sure looks like it's phones."
What is your takeaway? Not in your classroom at Middlebury, but if you were, talking to a friend over coffee or a drink, um, translate this into a very colloquial uh, takeaway.
You're asking me to be a human instead of an economist?
I'm guessing you're pretty good at that.
It's the phones. I would say we're seeing huge declines in births. And frankly, my personal human take is we should really be wondering what's going on. Why are births plummeting like this? It's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's certainly many aspects of it that really concern me, aspects that relate to economic growth and supporting older generations, but also questions of like, what does this mean for humans? Like I love kids. I like kids. They're a social good. I like seeing them around. I want more of them. I think they're great. And I also like people and want them to be happy. And so when I see a situation where people aren't forming partnerships and having children like they used to, I wonder why. And if everybody's just making a very careful, rational decision and they want to tell me that's what's best for their lives, then my answer is like, okay, as policymakers, we better figure out how to support an older generation when we have this shift. Um, But if instead what's going on is everybody's just doom scrolling on their phone, alone and isolated and not forming relationships, then I think a little bit differently about it.
But ironically, people are also scrolling on dating apps to
Sure.
deal with that loneliness, to find partners. And yet, um, that sounds like it's part of the problem.
Well, I don't know if it is. And I say this, I found my husband on a dating app. I imported him from Montpelier. I checked all of Vermont. I selected the best husband, reached out, and we're very, very happy. I don't want to knock dating apps. I think that it's, of course, any technology is a mixed bag. Of course, there are pros and cons. But what I would say about this iPhone result is it suggests that what we should be looking to when we think about declining births is forces at work that are changing how we form relationships and what human intimacy looks like. I'm perfectly willing to believe there are good components of a phone and that there are also bad ones. And also to be really clear, I'm not saying this is the single only explanation for declining births. Like we estimate that phones explain a third to half of the decline. That means something else is explaining 50 to 70% of it, right? So it's both a big number and not the only factor.
I want to shift to your research and writing into abortion access.
Sure.
But first, talk about where you grew up and what brought you to focus on the effects of abortion access, why that became really a focus of your professional life.
Yeah, so Vermonters always figure it out when I drop a y'all, but I'm a flatlander, which is confusing because I actually grew up in West Virginia, which is not all that flat. I spent the first half of my childhood in very, very rural West Virginia. I spent a lot of it in a holler, which is Appalachian term for kind of a rural community between hills. My holler had about 27 people in it. It's real middle of nowhere. People talk about how rural Vermont is, and I'm like, no, I feel right at home. This is great. Um, and then after my parents split up, I started sharing time between West Virginia and the Georgia-Alabama border. So I come from places where going to college is not expected. It's not a foregone conclusion, much less ending up going to college and then getting a PhD and then being an economics professor at a fancy liberal arts college in the Northeast. Like, this has been a real journey. And for me as an economist, that those experiences growing up made me really interested in a whole host of questions about how where we live, who our families are, what our resources are, affect our outcomes in life. And in particular, I started to get really interested in gender differentials in economic outcomes. And it turns out this is, by the way, this is the couple minute version of the giant biography I could perhaps write one day. But if you're studying gender differentials in economic outcomes, you have got to study fertility. You just have to. If you look at, for instance, the earnings gap for men and women, people like to cite the 80% earnings gap for men and women, which is roughly accurate. It turns out
That women earn 80% of what
of
men
what men
make.
earn, yes. It turns out that gap, it doesn't open until people have kids. If you look, for instance, at men and women coming out of college, their earnings look really similar these days. It's not until they have kids that all of a sudden women's earnings like basically fall off a cliff and men's earnings continue to increase. So if you want to understand these differentials, you have to think about fertility. And if you want to understand fertility, you have to think about the tools people use to control it. And one of those tools is abortion. And so years ago, I started studying abortion policy, and I just haven't run out of questions.
Your dad was a country doctor in West
Yes.
Virginia, and I wonder if some of what you saw and some of what he saw also had an impact on you.
Yeah, absolutely. I never quite belonged in a sense in West Virginia in that my dad was a country doctor in rural West Virginia at a time when West Virginia Medicaid was basically insolvent and not paying its doctors. I sometimes joke that my dad was earned the least of any doctor I ever knew, at least during that time period. But we're living in the middle of nowhere in this holler, and my dad is educated. And I was surrounded by books and I was reading all the time. We didn't have TV, but oh my gosh, I read so much. And I looked around me and I always understood that there were options that I was aware of that my friends weren't, and that my friends were facing different constraints on their lives. And it made me so curious when I got to academia. I had this sense of being a stranger in a strange land where most of the professors I would meet seemed to come from fancier backgrounds than I did. Like, honest to God, when I got to Middlebury College, I had never heard of a prep school. Like, I did not know what Exeter or Andover or Deerfield, like these fancy schools that people pay a lot of money to go to, like, I did not know what they were. And people would tell me about like the exam schools they went to in Boston, and I did not know what they were. Like, I'd never heard of them. I did not know they were prestigious. So I kind of started to straddle these worlds where I understood how tremendously different people's backgrounds and experiences and knowledge could be. And it just made me really interested in studying that.
So let's talk about the state of abortion access today. Who is most affected by abortion bans in the post Dobbs era now?
Sure, the post-Dobbs era is an inequality story. So basically nothing's changed in our area if you're seeking an abortion. In fact, if anything's changed, abortions have become more accessible in northern New England and New York State. And the reason is we have providers that have capacity to see patients, and post Dobbs, post the end of Roe, telehealth access to abortion expanded so that it's become much more feasible for people to order abortion medication through the mail. So there are parts of the country like ours where the Dobbs decision almost paradoxically expanded abortion access. But then there are parts of the country like the ones that I come from, the places that I have lived, rural West Virginia, Georgia, Alabama border. I've also lived in Louisiana and Texas. These are places where the states have enacted near total abortion bans. And there are still people avoiding them. So for folks who live in a state with a near total abortion ban, my estimates are that roughly probably 80, 85% of people who want an abortion are still getting one. They're either driving really long distances to reach states where abortion is illegal, or they're ordering pills through the mail. But that leaves the rest of that population, people, probably about 15 to 20% of people they want abortions, they're pregnant, they want an abortion. If abortion were still legal in their state, they would have gotten one. But now that it's not, they're trapped. They aren't finding the means, the information, the resources, the safety and security to travel long distances or to order pills through the mail, and they're giving birth as a result. So my research suggests that there are roughly about 30,000 additional births occurring in these places because of the Dobbs decision. And you won't be surprised by this. They're concentrated among people who are the most vulnerable of an already vulnerable population. It's concentrated among people who are younger, have less education, and have really limited financial resources.
So this is happening at a time where more than half of abortions are medication abortions. And why does access to a brick and mortar abortion clinic, which is, increasingly not the way people get abortions, why does that matter? And what have you found in your research about how much distance to an abortion clinic makes a difference?
Sure. So I've studied the effect of distance to an abortion clinic for years. I actually studied it even before the Dobbs decision because these states that have now banned abortion had been heavily regulating abortion providers in the 10 or 15 years leading up to Dobbs. And they were regulating providers out of existence. They were closing facilities. It was causing shocks to distance. I've been studying this question for a long time. And it's interesting because way back in the day when I would present my work on distance in an economics seminar, invariably, every time, somebody's hand would shoot up and they would say, wait, 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 wait. Distance, that can't matter. Why would that matter? If somebody has an unwanted pregnancy and they really want to get an abortion and they're weighing the cost of carrying that pregnancy to delivery, which are very substantial, against the cost of figuring out how to drive 50 or 100 miles to reach a facility, which is at the time what high distances looked like, they're always going to figure out how to drive. And I always felt like it was such a standard economic question that was so out of touch with the reality of people who are looking for abortions, who are often poor. They're financially constrained. Like if you look at survey evidence, 75% of people seeking abortions are low income. Um, about 80% in one study are very, very credit constrained. They cannot just put the gas on their credit card. More than 50% are experiencing disruptive life events, like they've just lost a job, they've just been evicted. More than half of them are already parenting. And so for me, as this like highly educated white professor lady, if one of my kids needed healthcare in Sweden tomorrow, I'd get her there. But I've also lived in a holler with 27 people in it in the middle of nowhere, and I fully understand that there are people who just cannot figure out how to get even 50 or 100 miles on short notice for healthcare. So that's my intuition, but also we actually just measure it in the data, right? I'm a scientist. We can measure this in the data. So I've put together this database of every brick and mortar abortion facility that's operated in the United States since 2009. It is a labor of love and or an obsession. I have 30 research assistants at Middlebury College who help me keep it up to date and keep the whole thing rolling. Um, I've been able over the years to use that to create natural experiments where there will be a sudden closure of a facility. Could be because the state regulates it out of existence, could be because of Dobbs. I've got, kind of different studies, but the sudden closure of a facility. And what we've seen over and over again is that a distance increase of even 50 or 100 miles, increases that like judges and some economists would be like, doesn't sound like a very big deal, would stop a significant portion of people who wanted an abortion from getting there. I would think that would be changing now. Because as you mentioned, now more and more abortions are medication abortions. Now, most of the medication abortions, those are the abortions you get by taking pills. People are still mostly traveling to facilities for those, right? So they're still going to the facility to get the pills. But starting in 2020, so this is recent-ish. I'm old, so 6 years sounds like nothing. Starting in 2020, you started to be able to order the pills through the mail. And at that point, we thought, okay, maybe this is going to be the death of distance. Now, if you can't make that trip, you can order the pills. And people are definitely ordering the pills. But the people who are getting the pills so far seem to be people who would have figured out how to travel. And so it's likely making this much easier for them, right? Like instead of having to figure out how to make this big long trip, they can order the pills and it's cheaper. But what we're not seeing is that those pills are reaching a lot of the people who weren't figuring out how to make the trip. So far at least, it hasn't been the death of distance.
You testified in the Senate last year in front of Senator Grassley's committee.
Yeah.
Talk about the experience. You came there as an economist talking about abortion. Just set the scene. What happened?
Sure. Well, it was really surprising to me actually. I received an invitation kind of out of the blue from Senator Whitehouse's staff in Rhode Island. They were putting together Senate Budget Committee hearings on the economics of reproductive policy. And they asked me to testify. And I believe in evidence-based policy, and I believe as a scientist who produces evidence that I, when asked, should go and translate it to people. So I always say yes, right? And so I said yes. And then I really had to laugh when I showed up because before you go into these hearings in the Senate, there's this back room where the witnesses who are going to testify are gathered. And I walked in at the appointed time, and it's just me. And all of the other witnesses who were going to testify, they looked like Rocky about to go in the ring. They like all had these people gathered around them, like, massaging their shoulders and like giving them water and like prepping them last minute. And I thought, oh, other people are going to be really prepped. and, and I'm just like showing up. Um, but I've taught for 21 years. I can show up and talk about things that I'm passionate about and know about, anywhere, anytime. And so I would say like it was both a really good experience and a little bit of a surprising experience in some ways. And I can talk a little bit about that.
So, yes, as I recall, you described Senator Grassley as beginning his remarks by talking about how, well, you describe it.
Sure. So Senator Grassley was then the ranking member of the committee, which meant that after Senator Whitehouse introduced, kind of set up the hearing, Senator Grassley got to make some prepared remarks before the witness testimony. And Senator Grassley's remarks, I'll kind of paraphrase, but I think anybody can Google it. And I think this is a very fair characterization. He dismissed the notion of having the hearings just out of hand. And what he basically said, and he is conservative and he is, I think he would characterize himself as pro-life. He said basically, look, life is priceless. Not, nothing that we're going to say here about the economics, like the economic considerations of abortion policy is going to be relevant. And actually, I wasn't super surprised by that notion, right? I grew up surrounded by people who, I grew up in very conservative areas. There's conservative members of my family. I deeply love and respect people who are very opposed to abortion, and I have Thanksgiving dinner with them, and I don't think they're bad people. I don't think they're misogynist. I don't think this is like coming out of some hatred. I think this is a really thorny issue. And what I heard Senator Grassley say is like essentially this. Look, if you truly believe that abortion is the taking of a human life, then as profound as the economic consequences of abortion access can be for women and their families, there's no effect that can justify taking a human life. I think that's what he was saying. And as an economist, it's not my job to do that cost benefit analysis. I was kind of like, fair enough. And And I can hear that, and I'm not upset. And I still think I have something to say here, which is if we are going to regulate reproductive autonomy, not just with abortion policy, but with contraceptive policy, with IVF policy, with all of the ways in which we enact policies that impact people's ability to freely make decisions about parenthood, we should understand what effects those policies might be. For instance, even if you believe that abortion should not be permitted under any circumstances, I think it's still fair to ask you to understand that this will result in an increase in births and that these births will be to particularly poor, vulnerable families that are poor, that are financially struggling, and that you might want to consider some social support here. So from my perspective, those introductory comments, they weren't super off-putting, but they also didn't convince me I shouldn't be there having my things to say.
So, as somebody who has grown up in both rural and urban places, places with people with high education, low education, red and blue, you have talked about, you gave a TED talk talking about the things that divide us and how the majorities of both sides view the other as unintelligent, close minded. And then you hear people, probably plenty in Vermont, have this either spoken or unspoken, who talk about, the South, and they just say, let them go. You know,
Yeah.
you have a particularly visceral reaction to that. I wonder how you would answer that because I hear versions of that as we are now dealing with really polarized things. And, there are Southern judges who are setting policy for the whole country. So you know, we are living in their world just as they are living in ours.
Sure. It breaks my heart when I hear folks say, as a Southerner, as a stranger in a strange land, although I've lived in Vermont for 21 years now, but as a Southerner, it breaks my heart when I hear people dismiss the people I grew up with, the places I'm from, the beliefs that they have. And frankly, we all know it's not just about dismissing faraway Southerners. There are these divides within our own state. And I think just taking a step back and taking a deep breath and believing, as I do, that the vast majority of our neighbors in our communities, in our country, genuinely want to do the right thing. Putting that in quotes, they genuinely want good things. They want to be good people. We want to be good people. We want to do the right thing. And it turns out life is complicated, policy is complicated. We're flooded with information. We're all trying to figure out how to like pick out truth and how to make meaning of it and how to reach decisions. And to see groups simply dismissed rather than just taking a breath and having like just offering them a little bit of grace and being like, yeah, this is complicated. I wonder why they believe what they believe. I wonder where they're coming from. I wonder whether we could potentially bridge these divides rather than saying, yeah, I just don't think this is going to work out. Like we're never going to agree, and the other side is bad. I really want to believe in and model and do my tiny little part to create a world where we give each other more grace. I say working on a very polarizing topic in my own research.
Does it feel like to you, because it does to me, that the Confederacy is rising again? We are seeing voting restrictions where, you know, states like Alabama, Mississippi, with large black populations are having all of their representation in Congress eliminated. They will have, when the gerrymandering is done, all white representatives. When it comes to reproductive rights, we have, the famously conservative courts in Texas blocking, putting national blocks on medication abortions, the availability of pills. But you've lived in this world. You're urging us not to other our neighbors. But how do you avoid? It seems the thing we are going back to a civil war kind of mentality, particularly as we are seeing the voting stuff coming up. I mean, the maps that we're seeing, where black representation is just being wiped out. It's like, huh, where have I seen that before in my history class?
Yeah.
Your
Let me
thoughts?
complicate this a little bit.
Okay,
I largely
please.
agree with you, but I'm gonna, and I also want to say you're inviting me to depart some from my particular area of expertise to talk more as just a human who happens to be from a different world and is reading the news just like you are. And I'll accept that invite.
Forgive
Because
me for treating a distinguished economist as a human
it's going to
several
be
times in this
tough. I
conversation.
know. Yeah, just you should ask me about the standard error in my regression, not the Voting Rights Act. um, okay, so here's what I want to complicate actually. When you talk about a return to the Confederacy, you bring up two particular issues, reproductive rights and voting rights. And I want to say I see those two as different in a really important way. So just from a historical perspective, um, back in the 19th century, back in the Civil War days, when states were moving to restrict access to abortion, because abortion was pretty much legal everywhere until some fledgling physician organizations and kind of anti-vice groups and a lot of eugenicists started campaigning to ban it. But when those campaigns started in the 19th century, uh, they were everywhere. They were in Vermont just as much as they were in the South. In fact, if you look at like abortion restrictions and contraception restrictions, they're like Connecticut had one of the last contraception restrictions in the United States. Vermont banned abortion, I think, in the 1860s with explicit, by the way, you should go back and read the historical record. It's really interesting. Explicitly eugenicist arguments about wanting to stop essentially white Protestant women from limiting the sizes of their families because they wanted them to have more kids. Like the history is complex, and I would not point to the South as being particularly distinct from other parts of the country during that era with reproductive policy. Um, Obviously, questions of race are extraordinarily different, but also during that era, and I would say particularly post-war Jim Crow period, rise of the KKK, you saw horrible, horrible discrimination in pretty much every part of the country that had significant minority populations. Like the KKK was huge in Indiana and Ohio, right? Where there were people coming from the Great Migration. So I often think when folks in the Northeast kind of look at race relations in the South, I sometimes think that they're kind of ignoring the fact that these issues have arisen in multiple places at multiple times where we've had large populations. Now, I'm not using that to excuse racism. I'm just going to say it's complicated. And with respect to the South, this is true everywhere. With respect to our current moment, I am extremely concerned about gerrymandering. I cannot believe we can't do a better job of figuring out our political process than letting politicians, now on both sides, although I would pretty much agree that the Republicans started it, but now on both sides, trying to basically draw these insane district boundaries to like, this is an affront to democracy. This is an affront to representation. That's distinct from the Voting Rights Act for me, and I guess I won't go down that rabbit hole. But what I would say is we are in a moment, a historical moment in our country that feels so perilous and so frightening. And I'm scared and I'm angry too. But lots of people are scared and angry. And when you ask them why, they'll say different things. And I just have to believe that we need to be able to have the conversations about those divides to find productive ways forward and not just condemn.
You have talked about there being power in the awkward places, and I wonder if we could end by just having you explain what that means from your own experience.
Sure. I think these conversations that I'm talking about, this giving people grace, talking across divides, they're super emotional. Like when you're having a conversation with somebody who disagrees with you, particularly when they disagree with you on something that you find to be of kind of profound importance, when you think they are disenfranchising a group of people, when you think they are responsible for, I'll use the word murder. This is not how I view abortion, but there are many pro-life activists who I take at their word that they view it as murder, right? So for them, when they're talking to me, they're talking to somebody who they view as condoning murder, right? Across both sides, people have really strong moral opinions. I get it, and it's super emotional. I think for me, the power is that I've spent so much of my life not feeling super confident that I was right or that I belonged. When I was in West Virginia, when I was growing up in these really poor rural areas, I was still a nerdy kid who read a lot and whose dad was a doctor, right? Running up and down the holler with folks. That was a different kid. I had different. I, I I was different, and I never quite felt like I belonged. And at the same time, it was my home. And when I came to Vermont, this place is so overwhelmingly liberal compared to the places that I grew up. And everybody that was in my circles, which is not to say they're all the circles, of course, but kind of my initial circles, there was often this assumption about like who we all were and where we came from and what we believed. And I often didn't agree with the things people were assuming that we all believed. And there's a certain awkwardness to that. And there's a certain moment of trying to figure out like, do I quietly raise my hand and say, yeah, we're not all on the same page here. How do I do that? How do I navigate that? And I think the discomfort also allowed me to practice over a long time, like not getting upset or as upset as I might. I still get upset. And just kind of taking a deep breath and figuring out how do I broach this? How do I acknowledge how somebody else feels about this? How do I acknowledge Senator Grassley's, not that I got to talk to him personally, but how do I acknowledge that, yeah, he has a certain point. I get it. I hear him. I understand it. And I think I have something to say that might still be relevant to him. And how do I say that in a way where I might be heard? And I think the more you can hold on to them, we've all had those moments in our life where we felt awkward and like we didn't belong and we were uncertain and we were trying to figure out how to speak. I think actually those are really powerful places. And if we could kind of harness that and use it when we broach these conversations, we might listen and hear a little bit better.
Well, Professor Caitlin Myers, I want to thank you for joining us on the Vermont Conversation and for allowing me to engage you both as a human and as an economist.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Caitlin Myers is the John G. McCullough Professor of Economics at Middlebury College and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. She is nationally known for her studies of the effects of abortion policy on people's lives, and her latest study looks at how smartphones have contributed to a dramatic drop in the birth rate. That does it for this week's Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. Thanks so much for listening.